We are here back in the Theater of Barrels to talk about the other beers in the Lion Den portfolio. We got a lot of beers this time around. We already talked about the 500 ml bottles, and now we're getting into these beautiful cork and cage bottles that come out of the Brynildson Barrel Works. These are Jim Crook's beers, and these are the very first release of our spontaneous program. And so I'll go into a little bit of the history of that. And in order to do that, to be honest with you, I almost have to go back to the very beginning of the Barrel Works program. So when we conceived of the Barrel Works program, the notion of spontaneously fermenting these beers really wasn't with us at all. It wasn't really an option that we were thinking. In fact, a lot of what we were doing was inspired by what other breweries here in the United States were doing to, as best they could, replicate the beers of the Lambic region of Belgium, which is in and around Brussels. If you're familiar with Belgium, it's a very small country. And the remaining spontaneous or Lambic or Goose producers are very close in and around Brussels, in the Brussels area, in and around Brussels. And most of the production there hinges on spontaneous fermentation. But what we started Barrel Works with was essentially an inoculated program where we were producing special worts, but using the microflora that we knew would create the same flavors that were coming from that Lambic area. So they're really Lambic inspired, but certainly not spontaneous beer. So we might start out by inoculating the wort with a wild yeast like Brettanomyces to help protect the wort, and then layer in some lactobacillus, some pediococcus, and try to derive the acidity and the complexity somewhat inspired by those beers. We always talked about it, and as time passed, a few, what I would say very brave brewers here in the United States pioneered some spontaneous brewing. Breweries like Allagash on the East Coast with their coolship program. Russian River, Vinny up in Sonoma County has done some spontaneous. Jester King in Texas, and on and on. So I would have to say in some ways we were a little bit of a latecomer to spontaneous fermentation, but Jim was very passionate about it. He had crafted for the brewery a very small 10-barrel coolship. A coolship is essentially a shallow pan that allows hot wort to go in, natural cooling to occur, and as that wort cools, because of that increased surface area and shallow pan, you start getting inoculation naturally from the air, and that's why we call it spontaneous. It's spontaneously going to ferment from the bacteria and the microflora in the area. We thought that would be especially interesting because we're in wine country and there's a lot of interesting microflora kind of floating around because of that. Some interesting wild yeasts that are naturally occurring on grapes, and on hopefully some microflora specific to that region. Now, the spontaneous fermentation that we've done was in and around the Brynildson area, and more specifically on David Walker's farm. He built a barn in recent years, and we crafted the coolship to fit in the dormers of the barn in and around the vineyard that David and Adam both have. So it's really all in the family and a pretty cool project. And I think Michaela's going to post some pictures of some of those original spontaneous ferments. It's really quite a magical process, and I could probably go on for another hour about some of the chemistry and everything about it, but let's get into the beer. We got to open this thing up. So the first one that we're going to open is the first spontaneous release, Ferus Fruitaneous. This is the first time you're seeing Craig Thomas on the camera. But Craig's been with us for a long time. He's a veteran in the industry, graduate of Heriot-Watt University, which is one of the great brewing schools in Scotland, in the UK, in the world, but it's located in Scotland. So he graduated from there, and he came on board originally as a brewer here at Firestone Walker, but later took on the sensory role in our quality control program and has really taken it to new levels. So we thought it would be great to bring Craig on board because he can talk us through what we're tasting and smelling, especially with something like this, a spontaneously fermented beer, which has so much complexity and so much going on. And of course, we have Ollie Razi,
hello,
production director here at the brewery. In many ways, my boss these days, because I have to ask him if we can do X, Y, or Z in the brewery. He does all the scheduling, all the coordinating. He just got back from a trip to Hawaii. That's why he looks so tan and relaxed.
Feeling good?
That relaxed vibe's going to go away here real soon when we start getting back into the production. But here we go, guys. Let's dig into this beer.
Oh,
cheers. Great to have you both.
So one thing Matt didn't mention was this beer is 3 years in the making. And from a logistical standpoint, we actually brewed the wort for this beer down at our propagator in Venice, California. And we actually had a jacketed tank that we had to bring all the way back up the highway to David's barn. And you'll see in some of Michaela's photos that she's going to post, we actually pumped that wort into the coolship itself. And the tank itself had what pretty much looked like a wetsuit around the tank to try to keep
we call it the Lamborghini.
The Lamborghini, that's right, that's right. And it did the trick because the wort was still hot when it got up there and allowed to cool overnight. So 3 years in the making, I had no idea what this thing was going to turn out to be. And I think he did a great job.
Yeah, I mean, I think that all of the small American brewers that have gotten into spontaneous fermentation have found that it's really a process that takes a long time to figure out if it's going to work and how best to work through it. And you have to have a lot of patience because these beers don't necessarily taste that great out of the gates. It takes a while for them to come into their own. And now, traditional lambic or goose production in Belgium would also include some 3-year beer. I mean, oftentimes it's a blend of young, 2-year, and 3-year-old beer, and the combination of those creates the complexity, maybe tones down some of the acidity using some young beer, but the more mature beers have some of the flavors that you're looking for as well. So it is really all about blending. It's all about patience. Yeah, it's no simple feat. We're so used to controlling the process as brewers, using a monoculture fermentation and being able to control everything. This is just the absolute opposite. And is in many ways closer to winemaking, spontaneous winemaking, I think, than anything else that we do. Craig, why don't you let us know a little bit about what you're smelling and tasting here?
Well, I think going off of what you're talking about versus controlled fermentations and spontaneous fermentations, I think the closest we've done to this beer before was Feral 1, which is an astounding beer, award-winning beer, but it's a constructed beer. And whenever I pick out Feral 1, it's always distinct characteristics that I pick out in that beer. It has a lot of oak quality to it. There's a definitive malt characteristic as well. This is a heavy wheated beer. I think it's about 40% wheat malt. But everything else within this beer it just seems more integrated. It's more layered and certainly more complex than anything that any human could come up with just by, mixing vials and everything. I find just so many different flavors in here. The first thing that shrieks out at me, there's a lot of fruit going on in it. The wild yeast that lay in and start fermenting this beer, they tend to produce a lot of different ester components. We use aged hops in this, which have a lot of fatty acids that are really good for esterification. So you get like a pineapple upside down cake, maybe even a little bit of strawberry going on, along with the traditional kind of lemongrass, lemon pepper that you often find in these like goose or lambic fermentations. Digging deeper in there, I get like really nice floral characteristics, even like jasmine, rose, and then the ubiquitous leathery, earthy, horse blanket characters that everybody talks about with these Brettanomyces beers. Yeah. I find it to be a really incredible, it's a journey of a tasting experience. I really like these type of beers. And talking about the journey, this one just brings me back to Belgium. It's like drinking Dry Fontaine back in a Belgian beer cafe.
Yeah, I know early on, Jim was always super curious about doing these spontaneous fermentations. And had been thinking about how he would construct that coolship and how he'd go about setting these aside and resting them and ultimately blending them. And I think he did a great job blending these components together. To me, what I get is a much softer acidity than I'm used to in like a Feral 1 or some of our other Barrelworks beers that have been made over the years. I don't get as much of the lactic acidity. Maybe I just want to believe this, that it's organic acids driven by some of the other natural microflora opposed to just straight lactobacillus. So, you know, it's acidic, but at the same time, it's a more pleasing and softer acidity overall.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It kept a nice pale color though, and to me that's always amazing. You know, after 3 years that a beer can still be so pale in color and so beautiful. It also has reasonable foam for something that's been sitting for so long, with so much microflora, what have you, going on. So, you know, really a nice beer. And I think, you know, mark this moment in time as the first spontaneous release, and also the base to the next beer that we're going to try. But what else? What do you think, Ollie?
No, I think it's great. It's got, to me, a lot of dry apricot and pepper aroma to it, and, you know, your traditional leather characteristics.
Yeah.
So I think it's a great beer. Again, I've been so pleased with the way that all of these beers have turned out from the spontaneous series here. It's quite impressive. I had no faith in this project. I'll tell you that right away.
Says the production director,
exactly.
has no patience for these
yeah,
kinds of
exactly.
things.
I'm like, what are we doing, and how long is it going to take? That's going to turn a profit here. So, cheers, everybody.
Yeah, and I was going to mention, you know, if you've been paying attention to what some of the other breweries have been doing, Allagash and Russian River, who've been two of the leaders in this whole spontaneous movement, recently did a friendship blend, and I think this is either the second or third time that they've done it, with Cantillon back in Belgium. And in some ways, that's a massive nod and a massive validation that these beers can be made in the United States, and that one of the premier Belgian producers went so far as to create a blend with those brewers, which in many ways gives us, you know, hope for the future of this program and beers like this. I mean, I just think it's amazing that, yes, indeed, beers inspired by lambic can be made here in California, can be made here in the United States. And they tend to take a little bit of, you know, that terroir, we use that word all the time, of the local microflora. So anyway, mark time. This is a nice step in the right direction for this kind of a program. I'm really happy with the beer.
Honestly, I think it's one of my favorite beers that we put out of the Barrel Works program.
Nice.
And part of it is that really tamed acidity you mentioned. I think it's just very integrated. Yeah, ticks all the boxes.
So now that we've tasted Ferus Spontaneous, we'll get into Ferus Fruitaneous. And as the name suggests, it's a fruited version of the same base beer. Mm-hmm. And going back to the tradition of lambics and of what happens in these breweries in Belgium that make these beers, I think it's really it naturally pairs up when you have these beers that have a heightened acidity, to think about ways of sweetening them up or flavoring them in such a way to complement that acidity. And so there's a lot of history, a lot of examples of fruited lambics. And these would essentially be these sour beers that are racked onto fruit. It's very common in Belgium to rack onto cherries. So there's a number of Kriek beers made with cherry. Framboise would be made with raspberry. And those are really two of the cornerstone fruits used in the making of these beers. However, I feel like really there's no limit to the different fruit that can be used. So again, when Jim was tasting through this and thinking about fruits to pair with it, he chose a very classic fruit, raspberry. And we've had a lot of success with using raspberry with these fruited beers. But then he kind of went out of the kind of normal lambic tradition and chose guava. And he used whole fruit in both cases. And much like the other fruited beers that we produced at Barrel Works, it's all about taking that spontaneous base beer that still has the living microflora in it, the living wild yeasts and other bacteria, racketing on top of whole fruit. That fruit also contains some microflora inevitably, and then allowing a secondary fermentation to take off, and the integration of the fruit flavors with that sour beer. And you know, I think some of the challenges there are, one, pairing the fruit with the beer, both aromatically, but then also flavor-wise. And then remembering that fruit also contains citric acid and other organic acids that are going to further amplify the acid or the tartness of the beer. So again, two fruits, very different, one very traditional, one not so traditional. And I'll turn it over to you guys to let us know what you think about it. But I mean, I guess I will mention, it's just got this beautiful rosé color to it. A little bit of opalescence, a little bit of haze, really nice foam.
Well, the guava and the raspberry really play well off each other too. Like just the effervescence of the CO2, I'm getting a ton of guava coming out of the nose itself. Reminds me of being on the island right now, but in a barrel room.
Yeah.
But no, I think this beer plays really well with what he was trying to do, something traditional but a little non-traditional at the same time.
Yeah.
I
I mean,
pushing the envelope a little bit.
Pushing the envelope.
Yeah.
That's what we do here. Craig.
Yeah.
No, yeah, it's all part of the program, and I think that Jim has been encouraged in recent years to go outside of his comfort zone and bring in a bunch of interesting and oftentimes tropical fruit. I think that we played around with mango and pineapple and some of these in Element, and in this case guava. Now, I don't know. I don't know that I've had another spontaneous beer or sour beer with guava before. I mean, it's really a first for me anyway. And like you said, it really comes up in the aroma, and it works really well with a little bit of that funk in the background. I really like it.
The thing I always like about the Barrelworks beers, and I think it's something to do with the sheer force of those fermentations that are just eating away, chomping away at every residual, anything that they can get. As a result of that, I always feel like I get the purest form of the fruit in there. It's just raw raspberry guava essence. There's nothing else to get in the way of it. It's always, I always find them to be really, really powerful and pure aromatic qualities that we get out of these.
Yeah. So back to Primal Elements, one of the ideas there was to try to tone down the total acidity and use tropical fruits and try to bring a little kind of new age idea to a fruited sour beer. This is trying to keep the same acidity levels of that spontaneous beer and enhance it somewhat with the fruit. So the TA was not messed with at all with this beer. This is 100% of the spontaneous beer and combined with the fruits. I really like it.
I do too.
There's no doubt though that the acid from the fruit elevates the acidity. I mean, this is it's a little more drying on the palate than the base spontaneous beer.
Yeah, if you dig into it, you can find some of the echoes of the base beer in there, but this is certainly a more fruit forward, obviously, but also just more perfumey. I think it brings out a little bit more of those floral aromatics from the base beer, focuses in a little bit. Bubbles look really nice.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there you go. You get to taste our first spontaneous releases. One non-fruited, one fruited, and fruited with something that is pretty exceptional and rare in many ways. I think it translated well. Got to meet Craig for the first time.
Hey.
And Ollie fresh off of vacation. So it's great to have tasted these beers with you guys. Cheers.
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 And cheers everyone in the club.
Cheers
Thanks
to
for coming along for the
Cheers.
ride.
Another great collection.